Hello, this is KSQD 90.7 Weekly Cutting Edge. I'm your host, Galina Hale, Professor of Economics at UCSC and Faculty Director at the Institute for Social Transformation. My guest today is Barry Eichengreen. Barry is a George and Helen Pardee Chair and Distinguished Professor of Economics and Professor of Political Science at UC Berkeley. Professor Eichengreen has numerous accomplishments, including an appointment as a senior policy advisor at the International Monetary Fund in the 1997-98, which was the time of the Asian financial crisis and Russia LTCM crisis. He has been awarded numerous honors and awards all over the globe. He is probably the world's most respected expert in financial crisis, monetary systems, and economic history, especially the global role of currencies, central banking, and the political economy of globalization. Most importantly, though, he's a slug. He graduated from UCSC in 1974. You can read his regular monthly column in Project Syndicate. His most recent book, Money Beyond Borders, Global Currencies from Crisis to Crypto, was published just this year by Princeton University Press. It's my pleasure and honor to welcome Barry.
Fun to be with you, Galina. Little known fact, I had a short live radio program with a friend on what was then called KRUZ. It broadcast out of the basement of Stevenson College.
Oh, wow. So long experience in radio broadcasting in Santa Cruz. So let's talk about that. So in the 70s, UCSC was a very young campus, and I'm sure the city was quite different from what it is today. So can you tell us how and why you came to study at UCSC and what was life like back then in Santa Cruz?
I'm not sure how different the city of Santa Cruz was then than now. There was less money rolling around. Fewer people had moved over the hill from Silicon Valley. But otherwise, I think the city was very, very similar. The campus was still almost brand new. So I was admitted to College 5, presently Porter College, the arts college, because it was only ramping up at that point and they didn't have an existing student body. It was an interesting experience for me. I'm not a performing artist to take extemporaneous acting class and participate in the other activities that were going on there. But Santa Cruz had no grades, few, if any, requirements. So we had to put our own program together. Sometimes I say I would have been better off to have a real college education where there was structure and requirements and expectations. But personally, I think I was served well by having to put my own program together, figure out what I wanted to take, sample a lot of different subjects. And I'm happy where I ended up, economics and economic history, which wouldn't have happened except for UCSC.
How did you decide to go to UCSC? I imagine you had other options.
It was the highest prestige, most
Mhm.
sought after UC campus in 1969. Perhaps one could make an argument for Berkeley, but I grew up in Berkeley. And, at the age of 18, I was happy to move a little further distance away from my parents and strike out on my own. Quite a few people from my high school ended up at College 5.
All right. Oh, that's very interesting. So I don't even understand. You designed like there was no required classes even in the freshman year.
E-
You started
Every
off with picking and choosing, like in the cafeteria.
every college had a one required course, and it
Mhm.
was an arts related course. At College 5, it might be a social science related core course at Stevenson and so forth, and so on. But beyond that, the major requirements were pretty minimal. I remember something like 8 or 9 quarter courses in economics to be an economics major.
Mhm.
So and a lot of people constructed their own interdisciplinary majors. I had a major that kind of combined history, and economics and political science, which is, of course, the combination that I do now.
So what drew you to those disciplines? Was it specific people or what was going on in the world at the time?
I was interested in history because my parents had had a difficult history living through World War II and all that. I was interested in the social sciences because of the politics of the 1960s before I went to university. Growing up in Berkeley, you could see those politics at firsthand. So my friends and I would go down to Telegraph Avenue in Berkeley
Hmm.
after high school and smell the tear gas, watch the
Hmm.
Oakland police chasing the university protesters. I basically sampled all of the social sciences. That was a really positive aspect for me of Santa Cruz experience. So I took anthropology, psychology, sociology,
Wow.
what have you. And I ended up in economics because it had more structure. It had a portfolio of models that could be used to make sense of a very complicated and confusing world. And those models could be used to make sense of history as well. So I always thought I wanted to study and read history, but history is so many facts, one on
Hmm.
top of the other. You need some kind of structure in order to make sense of it. And economic models were, again, a way of ordering historical evidence and beginning to make sense of it.
Yeah, so these days, if you want to go to graduate school in economics, you need to take a lot of math and statistics. Was it also the case back then? And were you already planning to go to grad school?
I was uncertain what I was going to do at after university. I took a quarter of calculus
Hmm.
as an undergraduate. So no, it wasn't necessary to do that in order to um, become a graduate student in economics. But I had one other important experience at Santa Cruz. We had a meeting during my senior year. A couple of dozen economics majors and a handful of faculty met outside, sitting under a tree, and we talked about what economics majors might do after graduating. The
Hmm.
professor said, well, you could go to Washington, D.C. to work for government. And I thought that was kind of an intriguing idea. I went to talk to him. He was a labor economist. He'd spent time as a postdoc at the Department of Labor. So he said, write my old friend so-and-so at the Department of Labor, and maybe he'll have a position for you. I wrote, the guy never wrote back. So I went back to my professor, who was suitably embarrassed. He'd also been a postdoc at the Brookings Institution.
Hmm.
So he wrote there. They had an opening. I went to Brookings in Washington, D.C. for a year. My job was basically to write the individual income tax code in Fortran, the programming language of the time. So I wrote a crude version of TurboTax, if you will.
Hmm.
But I also had the year to brush up on some math courses at night and get the seal of approval of my boss at
Hmm.
Brookings, who had graduated from Yale. So I ended up as a PhD student at Yale, despite having very little math.
Oh, wow, that's impressive. I don't think it's possible today. I think it's very competitive and very formal these days.
Yeah.
And I realized when you said you wrote to him, you probably wrote him a letter that's sent by mail that nobody does these days anymore. Um, and when you went to do a PhD, was academic career on your mind? You specifically wanted to become a teacher, professor after that, or you still had your eye on policy?
I wasn't 100% committed. I certainly was attracted to the academic lifestyle. Growing up in Berkeley, my parents were not academics, but when they had a dinner party, half the people around the table would be professors. And I would hear stories about how they had job security, they had tenure, which was quite
Mhm.
remarkable. They could kind of set their own work agendas as they pleased, and they could travel, they could take sabbaticals. That seemed like an attractive combination. So that appealed. At the same time, after the Brookings experience, I went back to Washington during summers as a summer intern at the Congressional Budget Office. So I
Hmm.
built their tax model when they started up as well, given my Brookings experience. And I went to the IMF to work on tax effort studies. Why do some countries underperform when they try to raise taxes? And the life of a PhD economist in Washington seemed attractive as well. So I was torn, but academia won out in the long run.
Yeah, I can see that. And so you've been basically teaching and doing research ever since. And you teach economic history. That's the class I took from you at UC Berkeley. And your research combines economic analysis and lessons from economic history. And, I know that not all econ PhD programs have that economic history component. So when you started your academic career, was it more common to combine history and economics and political science, or were you unique in a way?
It was somewhat more common, but the situation was pretty much like it is today, that there were some leading programs where there were economic historians on the economics faculty. There was an economic history requirement for PhD students, and there were other programs where the subject was not represented at all. Uh, I had a couple of good programs to pick between in the end, and they both had prominent economic historians. The one I did at Yale had a very peculiar program where you did your coursework in economics, and then you went over to history and did PhD coursework there
Oh,
before
wow.
coming back to economics and finishing your dissertation. So I did that, and my longtime Berkeley colleague in the history department, Jan de Vries, did it in the other direction.
Hmm.
I'm think there were about four of us who had the pain tolerance to work all the way through that program.
So did it take you longer because of that, or did you
It,
still complete it?
it took a year longer. So
Okay,
a year additional year in graduate school before you have to go off and work for a living is not so bad.
right. I know. I took 6 years. Um, well, so let's talk about the importance of history in economics. So that kind of permeates your entire research agenda, whether the research paper or book is explicitly historical or not. You always draw on lessons of history. So, can you talk about why it's important and what might be the limitations of relying on history to understand what's going on today?
As I said before, history is wild and woolly, and you have to have some kind of structure, a portfolio of models or something like that in order to begin to make sense of it. And there is a danger of imposing modern models on past eras when structures were fundamentally different. The positive way of putting it is if you want to understand what is unique about the present day, you need to put it in historical perspective and compare present with past. So I like to think that the parallels between various historical episodes and today may be more valuable and informative for their differences, why
Mhm.
past experience doesn't apply in full to what we're going through now, as you know, the um, as are the regularities. So I do try to um, point to when I compare historical experience with present experience, and I do a lot of that. I do like to point to parallels in order to get people thinking, get myself thinking, but then really to focus on what is new and different, unprecedented, if you will, about the present is something that history can highlight.
Do you want to give an example of, I don't know, maybe something that's going on today and the historical context for that and the differences?
Gosh. So, I think um, my most recent book is on global currencies, on currencies that are used not only in the issuing country, but around the world, the US dollar up until now being a prime example. If you look and say, what do those kind of global currencies in history, starting with ancient Greece and Rome and coming up to the United States today, have in common? They are the issuer is an economic and commercial and financial power, but you can also find cases that don't conform to those regularities. So an example would be 14th and 15th century Florence, a tiny city-state that was nonetheless a major financial power on the back of the powerful banking families, the Medici and the Bardi and the others that set up basically multinational branch banks all over Europe and beyond. So I've kind of reframed your question, not so much about today, but to say that if you look at history, you can see regularities, but you can also see exceptions.
So was Florence like an offshore center of those times?
Well, so Florence was a wool cleaning and finishing city. So they imported raw wool from England and Northern Europe. They had lots of free-flowing water, so they cleaned the wool and they dyed it. But they needed to be able to pay their English and Northern European suppliers, so they built these banking relationships. And it was on the basis of the banking that they could raise mercenaries and defend the city. They could project power, even though they didn't have much in the way of their own natural resources other than the free-flowing water.
I see. Oh, that's very interesting. So let's talk about a little bit about what's going on in the world today. There's a long list of issues that people are concerned about, from climate change to geopolitical risks, rising persistent inequality, crypto, the billionaires, of course, the role of AI. Do you want to share any of your thoughts on the current state of the world and maybe give us some historical context of what we maybe should worry less about?
Well, what is on the top of my own list of worries is the realization that U.S. institutions are not as strong as we had for a long time believed, that the place of the United States in the world economy, the place of the dollar in the global monetary and financial system rest on rule of law in the United States, separation of powers, the idea that the Congress and the courts and the press, the fourth estate, can restrain power-grabbing U.S. president on control of corruption, and the realization that the corruption problem is greater, rule of law and separation of powers are weaker than we had been led to expect. And I think that has eroded trust in our institutions, not only at home, but around the world. That the Europeans, whenever I go over there, they tell me how they feel uncomfortable relying on the United States for NATO-related defense protection, on the dollar for international financial services. They feel they need to become more self-reliant militarily, financially, and otherwise. So I worry that the relatively peaceful, relatively stable order that the United States took a lead in building after World War II is now in an accelerating state of decay because of the problems we have created for ourselves at home through political polarization and large amounts of money concentrated in the hands of a few who can use it to manipulate the political system, and that this has very negative repercussions for what kind of policies we follow in the US, how other countries around the world feel about us, and that impacts pretty much everything else you spoke about, Galina, on your list, from global policy toward climate change, geopolitical conflict, financial instability. income inequality, on and on and on.
So would you describe the current political situation in the US as a democracy?
I think we are uh, certainly a democracy, but we're a troubled
Hmm.
democracy where not everybody has the same voice. And, functioning democracies run on the integrity of elections and on a set of institutions that can check and balance overreaching officials. And there are
Hmm.
questions about all of the above. Questions about all of the above have arisen in the last decade and certainly in the last couple of years.
Hmm. So more globally, I frequently wonder whether democracy is just a phase of the, human historical development and whether there is like a generational cyclical component to it. I'll give you an example. Um, you know, when I grew up in Soviet Union, there was a very powerful anti-war culture. There is the memorials almost on every block in Moscow to World War II. Russia lost what, 150 million people, I think, in World War II. You probably know better than I. And every family essentially had somebody who did not come home. And so my mother was born just before World War II. So it's very much, in my being, that experience. I have lost both my grandfathers in the war. And my grandmother survived the blockade of Leningrad. But that now is a couple generations later, there are hardly any survivors. And so, now the popular opinion is not very anti-war in Russia, which is what allowed Putin to invade Ukraine in 2022. Do you think that kind of generational memory contributes to, you know, people's um, appreciating the value of democracy? Because hardly anybody in the US understands what it's like to be in a different
Yeah, I
regime.
do. I do. Winston Churchill famously said that democracy is the worst political system, except for all the others. And
Mhm.
I think it's important to try to remind us that Francis Fukuyama was wrong, when he said in 1990, we're witnessing the end of history where there will be democracies and only democracies. The contest between democracy and autocracy is now officially over with the
Mhm.
end of the Soviet Union at all, that we do have to fight for democracy in order to retain it. And the fewer people who have lived through the alternative, probably the fewer people who see the urgency, the need to make personal sacrifice in order to defend it. But
Mhm.
you ask me, what can we be optimistic about? I think there are a lot of people in Hungary and Poland and in Russia who've seen the alternative in action and who will be either are or will be prepared at some point to fight for political voice for a form of democracy.
Mhm.
So I guess I am relatively hopeful on that score. I wish I could give you a scenario through which we rebuild our democratic political institutions in this country, in the United States, where electoral institutions, the power of the Congress, have been visibly weakened in recent years, where there has been some democratic backtracking. In other words, I don't yet see the way forward, but I guess you wanted something to be optimistic about. I think I would be optimistic that those people will be out there on the front lines fighting for democracy.
Do you think that also might be the case in China?
Um, yes, I do. I think, people have been Chinese people have been happy with the Chinese system in part because they started out in 1979 in a situation of extreme poverty before real economic reform began. And the existing one-party authoritarian system has delivered the goods. Living standards have been transformed. But now economic growth in China is slowing to
Mhm.
4% in the most recent quarter, and it's going to go down further over time, not go up. Income inequality is rising in China. So I think the simple fact that the government has delivered higher living standards will less and less suffice to um, suppress political dissent, make people stay quiet politically. Um, when that change will develop, I can't say.
Mhm.
Give them a forecast, as I just did. Give them a date. Never give them both.
Right. It's also like earthquakes, you know where they know they're gonna happen, you know where, but you don't know when. Um, so another kind of related question. Do you think our generation is the most well-off generation? And because of all the problems in the world, our children, grandchildren will be less prosperous, at least in the West, compared to, us in the Western world?
I feel that we were very fortunate that when we came out of school, there were plenty of opportunities. And whether those opportunities still exist today for recent graduates is quite unclear. There's a lot of chatter to the effect that they don't. Um, I do think that the third quarter of the 20th century, which was precisely when I grew up, was the most successful quarter century economically that the Western world certainly had ever seen. The French call it the 30 glorious years, faster growth than ever before
Hmm.
or after. So I do worry that because of economic problems, political problems, the fact that um, climate change and environmental issues generally are it was possible to ignore almost everything except the smog problem in Southern California.
Right.
It's growing up now. There are, for those of us who are scrambling to obtain homeowners insurance in a fire-prone state, the problems are much more widespread.
Right. Okay, one more question. We have about a minute left. What about AI? Was there a precedent? Are we, shall we worry? Is it going to steal our jobs? Is it going to kill us all?
Well, so is AI simply the third coming of the railway and
Right.
electricity? Um, Both of those were revolutionary technologies that changed how, when, and where people worked. I do think that there will be new jobs to replace old jobs at, in the age of AI, just like there were new jobs to replace old jobs when electricity came along, and before that, when the railway came along. The problem is you've got to give people the skills and training they need to decide I can no longer work in that old occupation. I need to strike out and do something else. So that's, I think, why you and I are in the occupation we're in. We're trying to give people the skills and aptitude they need to figure out what's next.
Well, that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much, Barry, for your time. Um, it was a very interesting conversation, and I wish we had more time to continue.
One for me too. Thank you, Galina.
This has been Cutting Edge at KSQD 90.7. I'm Galina Hale. Goodbye.